Corbin hadn't set foot in his hometown since the day his brother Alistair's boat was found empty on the reservoir. For 12 years, drowning was the only answer anyone had. He returned only to sell the old house, to finally close that chapter. But a historic drought has gripped the county, and as the water level recedes, the spire of the old town's Sunken church has breached the surface for the first time in 50 years, and a drone photo on the local news shows something impossible chained to its cross. It's amazing how a single image can change everything you thought you knew. If you've ever had a moment that completely turned your world upside down, I'd be interested to hear about it in the comments below. The grief had been a low, constant hum in Corbin's life for 12 years, a background noise he'd learned to live with. He'd left Garnet Valley, South Carolina, and never looked back, building a life as a commercial diver in the turbulent waters of the Gulf of Mexico. He worked hard, saved his money, and kept relationships at arm's length. The pain of losing his older brother Alistair and his bright 8-year-old nephew Reese had been an anchor, and the only way to stay afloat was to cut the line connecting him to the past. But now, his parents were gone too, and the task of clearing out Alistair's old house fell to him. The house stood exactly as it had 12 years ago, a dusty monument to a life cut short. Maps of the local topography were still tacked to the walls, books on regional history were piled on the nightstand, and in the corner of one room, a small wooden chest held Reese's collection of rocks and feathers. Each object was a ghost. Corbin moved through the rooms with a detached efficiency, boxing up a life, trying not to feel. He just wanted it to be over. On his third day back, he took a break from the suffocating silence of the house and went into town for coffee. The local diner was the same as he remembered, worn linoleum floors and the smell of stale coffee and bacon. A small television was mounted in the corner, playing the local news. The anchor was talking about the drought, the worst in a century. Then the screen cut to a drone shot, sweeping over the vast, exposed mudflats of the Santee Reservoir. Corbin knew those waters better than anyone. It's where Alistair had taught him to swim, to fish, to be brave. The drone footage zoomed in on a sight no one alive had seen in over half a century. The black, moss-covered steeple of the old Ellerton Church, rising from the water like a skeletal finger. Before the valley was flooded in the 1940s to create the reservoir, Ellerton had been a thriving little town. Alistair, the historian, had been obsessed with it, spending every spare moment on his boat, using side-scan sonar to map the submerged streets and buildings. Corbin was about to turn away when the camera angle shifted, zooming right in on the iron cross at the steeple's peak. His breath caught in his throat. Wrapped around the junction of the cross was a thick, rusty chain, and attached to it was a small metal box. It was unmistakably modern, a pelican case or something similar, glinting in the harsh sunlight. It didn't belong. It was wrong. Every instinct in his body screamed that this was connected to Alistair. The detached calm he'd carefully constructed for 12 years shattered into a million pieces. The old, aching question, what really happened out there, roared back to life, louder than ever. He left his coffee untouched on the counter, threw a $10 bill down, and walked out. He had a new purpose. He had to get that box. The Garnet Valley Sheriff's Department was a small, tired-looking brick building. The man behind the desk, Sheriff Brody, was younger than Corbin, with a dismissive air that set Corbin's teeth on edge. He listened to Corbin's story with barely concealed impatience. "Sir, it was 12 years ago," Brody said, leaning back in his chair. "A tragic accident. The currents in that reservoir are no joke. What do you think a box on an old church is going to change?" But as Corbin argued, an older woman in a deputy's uniform emerged from a back office. Her name tag read G. Rowe, Deputy Gretchen Rowe. Corbin vaguely remembered her from his childhood. She had kind, sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "I remember your brother, Alistair," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight of genuine sympathy. "He used to come in here all the time, showing us old maps he'd found. Passionate man." She looked at Sheriff Brody. "What's the harm in letting him check it out? If it's nothing, it's nothing. If it gives this family some peace, it's worth the time." Brody sighed, clearly annoyed, but reluctantly signed the authorization for a recovery dive. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Corbin felt the first flicker of hope he'd felt in over a decade. The next morning, Corbin was on the water. He'd brought his own gear down from Florida, professional-grade equipment that felt alien in the calm, murky water of the reservoir compared to the deep sea. Deputy Rowe stood on the shore, a small, reassuring presence. As Corbin slipped into the brown water, the cold was a shock. The world went silent, replaced by the sound of his own breathing through the regulator. Visibility was poor. He followed the line of the Steeple down, his light cutting a pale green tunnel through the gloom. Algae and sediment coated everything. Then he saw it. The box was just as the drone had shown, secured with a heavy, padlocked chain. It took him 10 minutes of hard work with a pair of bolt cutters, his muscles burning in the cold water, before the chain gave way. He clipped the box to his harness and began his ascent. Back on the shore, he and Gretchen laid the box on the tailgate of her patrol truck. It was heavier than it looked. Using a crowbar from his truck, Corbin wedged it into the seam and pushed with all his weight. The plastic groaned and then snapped open. Inside, nestled in foam that was starting to decay, was a thick, vacuum-sealed bag. Corbin's hands shook as he tore it open. He pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages swollen and warped by moisture, and a single, strangely shaped key, like something from an antique cabinet. With a sinking feeling, Corbin opened the journal. Most of the ink had bled into illegible blue clouds. He carefully turned the damp pages, his hope fading with each one. Then he got to the back. The last 3 pages were written in heavy pencil, the indentations still clear. Alistair's neat academic handwriting was frantic, almost a scribble. The first legible entry described his sonar scans. He'd found anomalies in the basements of the submerged Ellerton General Store and post office. They weren't debris. They were large, rectangular shapes, consistent with modern shipping crates. He wrote about seeing a boat out on the reservoir late at night, a sleek, powerful vessel with no running lights. He recognized it as belonging to the Sterling family. The Sterlings were local royalty, owning thousands of acres of timberland and property around the lake. They were powerful, private, and according to town gossip, ruthless. The final entry made Corbin's blood run cold. It was dated the day they disappeared. "They saw us," Alistair wrote. "Came right up to the boat. Silas Sterling himself. Asked what we were doing. I tried to play dumb, said we were just fishing. He didn't believe me. He looked at Reese. Reese is so scared. They're gone now, but I saw them watching us from the shore. Their boat is coming back. I have to hide this. The official story that Alistair and Reese had been caught in a sudden storm was a lie. This was no accident. Corbin looked at Deputy Rowe, whose face was grim. "The Sterlings," she said, her voice low. "They've run this county for 100 years. If they're involved—" She didn't finish the sentence. Corbin knew what she meant. They were untouchable. But Corbin didn't care. He had a piece of the truth. Now, he just needed to find out what that strange key unlocked. He spent the next 2 days tearing Alistair's house apart, trying the key on every lock, every chest, every door. Nothing. He sat in his brother's study, surrounded by books and maps, feeling the frustration build. He reread the journal entry again and again. "I have to hide this." He wouldn't have hidden the key far from what it opened. His eyes scanned the room and landed on a large framed map of the county from the 1930s, before the reservoir existed. It showed the Sterling timberlands, a vast expanse of green. On the edge of their property, bordering what was now a state forest, Alistair had made a tiny pencil mark. Next to it was a single word: cabin. Corbin remembered the stories. His grandfather had owned a small hunting cabin deep in those woods, a place he'd sold off decades ago. Alistair must have found it. It was a long shot, but it was the only one he had. The next morning, he drove his truck as far as the old logging road would allow, then started hiking. After an hour of pushing through thick underbrush, he found it. The cabin was little more than a pile of rotting logs, the roof caved in on one side. As he approached, a voice cut through the trees. "That's far enough." A man stepped out from behind a large oak tree. He was tall and lean, with the same cold, assessing eyes Corbin remembered from photos of the family patriarch. "This is private property. You're trespassing." "I'm looking for a place my grandfather used to own," Corbin said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're on Sterling land," the man replied, his voice calm but laced with menace. "I suggest you turn around and go back the way you came." It was Heath Sterling, the oldest son. The confrontation was short, but it confirmed Corbin's suspicions. The Sterlings were guarding something out here. He waited until Heath Sterling's truck drove off before circling back around, approaching the cabin from a different direction. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. He used the flashlight on his phone to scan the floor. Most of it was rotten, but near the old stone fireplace, one floorboard looked newer than the others. He got his fingers under the edge and pulled. It came up easily. Beneath it was a small hidden compartment, and set into its side was a small ornate lock, the lock he'd been looking for. With a trembling hand, Corbin inserted the key. It slid in perfectly. He turned it, and with a soft click, the lock opened. Inside the compartment was a metal ammunition box. He lifted the lid. This time, there was no water damage. The contents were pristine. There was another notebook, a disposable camera, and a set of audio cassettes. Corbin sat on the dusty floor of the ruined cabin and began to read. This journal was a meticulous record. Alistair had documented everything: dates, times, boat registration numbers. He'd used the camera to take long-distance photos of the Sterlings on their boat at night, using infrared film, transferring crates from their boat to a hidden winch system that lowered them into the submerged basements of Ellerton. He had even managed to record one of their conversations using a parabolic microphone from the shore. It was a full-blown smuggling operation, using the sunken town as an untraceable storage and transfer point. But it was the last page of the journal that stopped Corbin's heart. It was a hastily drawn map of the main Sterling compound, a few miles from the cabin. A small, separate building near the back of the property was circled in red. Next to the circle, Alistair had written a final, gut-wrenching note. They took Reese. They have him at the guest house. Said he'd be safe if I went with them, if I kept quiet. My life for his. Forgive me. Corbin stared at the words, the world tilting on its axis. Alistair hadn't drowned. He had been murdered. And Reese hadn't been on the boat. He hadn't drowned. For 12 years, everyone had been wrong. His nephew could still be alive. The discovery that a loved one sacrificed themselves to save another is a heavy burden. If you were Corbin, could you ever forgive Alistair for making that choice, even if it meant Reese survived? Share your thoughts on this impossible situation in the comments. And if these kinds of stories that uncover long-buried truths resonate with you, consider subscribing and enabling notifications so you don't miss the next chapter we unfold.